So, I'm Doug Allen from the Philosophy Department, and this program is entitled Karl Marx's German Ideology, a Revolutionary Work and Its Significance Today. So, I thought of this because, well, there were two reasons. One was I was in Romania in June. And as some of you know, I did a lot of writing and lecturing on Mircea Eliade, and I knew him too. And there was a period in the 1960s, 1970s, where he was often described as the world's foremost scholar of religion and the leading interpreter of myth and symbolism. And he was Romanian. So he's still a national treasure in Romania, and I had a book that was published in Romania, and so they invited me to come, and mainly I gave Eliade lectures. And one of the contacts was Professor Sorin Alexandrescu, and his sister, his mother, Sorin's mother, was Eliade's sister. And she stayed in Romania, in Bucharest, when Eliade left. The son had a very distinguished career as a professor of philosophy at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and his specialization was semiotics. And so he's not a Marxist scholar, hasn't done any work on Marx. But we were talking, and he said to me, you know, Marx's name came up, and he said, well, I just so admire Marx's German ideology. It's an incredible text. And then I thought, when we were putting the series together for the fall, I said, you know, here it's Marx's social studies. We go for years and years without a single program on Marx. And I go, Marx is the most important formative thinker in Marxist studies, and from my point of view in socialist studies as well. So I thought, okay, it'd be nice to have a program focusing on Marx. So I selected this topic, and what I would like to, and I'll have to be very selective today because there's so much in the German ideology that I'll just share with you not everything that's worth sharing. But what I'd like to do, I thought I'd do it this way. I'm going to read you, I've selected some quotes from the German ideology. I'll just read them at the beginning to you, because I think they're remarkable quotes, and it gives you a little flavor, a sense of what the work is like. Then I'll give you a very brief background on the work, and then I'll go through about 5 or 6 of the major themes that I think are very relevant today. Just as relevant, if not more, than when Marx wrote them. So here are a few quotes from the German ideology. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. That is, the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. I'll use the male formulation. Usually I make it generic, but I'll just give you the exact words Marx used at the time. Men can be distinguished from animals by consciousness, by religion, or anything else you like. They themselves begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization. As individuals express their life, so they are. What they are, therefore, coincides with their production, both with what they produce and with how they produce. The nature of individuals thus depends on the material conditions determining their production. The production of ideas, of conceptions of consciousness, is at first directly interwoven with the material activity and the material intercourse of men, the language of real life. Private property is thus the product, the result, the necessary consequence of alienated labor, of the external relation of the worker to nature and to himself. Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. The mode of production must not be considered simply as being the production of the physical existence of individuals. Rather, it is a definite form of activity of these individuals, a definite form of expressing their life, a definite mode of life on their part. Men are the producers of their conceptions, ideas, etc., real active men as they are conditioned by a definite development of their productive forces and of the intercourse corresponding to these up to its furthest forms. Consciousness can never be anything else than conscious existence, and the existence of men is their actual life process. Okay? So those are a selection of some key passages, and as I go through some of the themes, you can think about them. Let me just give you a little background. Marx, and sometimes the German ideology is attributed to both Marx and his collaborator Engels. Sometimes Marx is listed as the author, and sometimes the two of them are. They wrote this work in late 1845, and they finished it in 1846, mainly while they were in Brussels. Now Marx, at this point, Marx was 30 years old. 30 years old. Just before that, 1844, he had written the famous economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, in which he had given, among other things, the very detailed analysis of alienation, of alienated labor. Then in 1845, he published the famous Theses on Feuerbach. It's only 2 pages. In fact, many people say that the Theses on Feuerbach were the outline for the German ideology. Then they wrote this in 1845 and 1846, and of course a few years later they wrote the Communist Manifesto and many other works. Now, what's interesting is it was never published. They tried to find many publishers, they got funding, they could not get it published. Finally they gave up, and in a famous statement Marx wrote that they had achieved their main purpose, which was self-criticism, and they would leave the manuscript to the gnawing criticism of mice. Apparently they left it in an attic, and the evidence is that there was some evidence that mice had gnawed at it. It was not published until 1932. It was published by the Marx-Engels Institute in Moscow. It was completed in 1846. It was published in 1932. So Lenin, many other thinkers never knew it existed. And what's interesting is it kind of rambles on. It's the German edition was set to 700 pages. 700 pages long. It focuses on a critique of Feuerbach, who's a materialist, Marx knew. It focuses on a critique of the Hegelian tradition, Hegel being the formative philosopher, and many of what were called the young Hegelians, Marx's contemporaries, including some very influential thinkers. Especially he targets Bruno Bauer, and the most he targets is Max Stirner. And the famous part of it, the best known part that I'll focus on, is part 1, which is the most coherent. Okay? And the other parts often are quite sarcastic. rambling in their critiques of these other formative thinkers. The first part is what we generally identify, what Marx called his materialist conception of history, or historical materialism. This is his most comprehensive formulation of historical materialism in part one of the German ideology. And of course he wrote thousands of pages illustrating this. But this is his major formulation, so it's a very important text. Now, what I'd like to do is just go through a number of topics, leading topics that you find in the German ideology. And I just want to read you the first paragraph. It's a very dramatic paragraph, and it kind of sets this up. So I'll just read you this. As we hear from German ideologists, Germany has, in the last few years, gone through an unparalleled revolution. The decomposition of the Hegelian philosophy, which began with Strauss, has developed into a universal ferment into which all the powers of the past are swept. It was a revolution beside which the French Revolution was child's play. A world struggle besides which the struggles of the Diadochi appear insignificant. These were the Macedonian generals who, after Alexander the Great, they divided up his empire. Principles ousted one another. Heroes of the mind overthrew each other with unheard of rapidity. And in the 3 years, 1842 to 1845, more of the past was swept away in Germany than at any other time in 3 centuries, and at other times in 3 centuries. And Marx writes, all of this is supposed to have taken place in the realm of pure thought. Then, certainly, it is an interesting event we are dealing with, the putrescence, namely the decomposition, the stinking decomposition of the absolute spirit of the Hegelian absolute idealism, absolute spirit. Okay, so you can see Marx's sarcasm that he has here, and that here are all these revolutionary thinkers sweeping away everything in the past, and it's all in their head, all in the matter of pure thought. So what he says is, it's very interesting. He says that right after that, he says that these German young Hegelians, some of whom consider themselves socialists and attack Marx, but they had a pure socialism, and who claim that they're just devastating the pure absolute idealism of the master of Hegel. He says they have not examined their premises. In other words, they have totally detached their philosophy, these categories, from actual life in Germany, the actual life activity within which they are living. Which, if you have the right category, you can just put everything into these essences. And what he's saying is that these anti-Hegelians, radical, trashing of Hegel, they're actually very Hegelian. Because in not examining their basic premises, they accept the Hegelian framework. It's just they're negating what Hegel affirmed, but in fact it's the same way of doing philosophy, history, politics, and it actually exists within the same framework. So to me this is a very valuable critique because I see it every day. And in many of our programs, like the last the program we had here 2 weeks ago before the election, which was a very good program. One of our colleagues presented. And it's all this debate. The Democrats, the Republicans. If Obama wins, if Romney wins. And going through each of the technical things about Obamacare, about all these issues, it's all operating, in terms of as a revolutionary work, it's operating within the same framework. And then we're debating this or that. And so the fact of negation often involves, looks like it's so radical, but actually it often operates within the same framework of what you're negating. And that shapes your philosophy. For example, I mean, you can give all kinds of examples. Someone, for example, who has a radical critique of poverty, of wage labor. I went to this banquet against hunger on campus and so on. It was all within a kind of charity. How can we help people? It accepted the whole framework of society. And then how can we meet needs? Or how can we raise pay? But it operates within the same framework of wage labor, the domination of capital, or say religious terms. People who often, Marx says atheism is a very limited position because it's so defined by not theism. There's that God that you've got to refute, right? And you're operating within the same framework. If there was no God there to be negated, you'd have a radically different position, right? So, what Marx is saying here is that these young Hegelians have not examined their premises. And that's what he's now trying to do. He's saying, so what does that mean? Let me just give you the way he critiques it, develops it later. He uses the term German ideology, ideology. Now, within Marxist literature, ideology has several different, radically different meanings. But the meaning that Marx has here is that in ideology, you have everything inverted, everything turned upside down. So it's customary to say, well, Marx turned Hegel on his head. Hegel was this absolute idealist. Marx is a materialist, a historical materialist. He turned Hegel on his head. Actually, that's not Marx's position. Marx's position is that Hegel's already standing on his head. And we're trying to turn him right side up. So what Marx is saying is that if you look at the way we've done philosophy overwhelmingly, from Plato on, East and West, the way we've usually done history, politics, in our campaigns, when we talk about democracy, freedom, equality, whatever, is what he's calling this form of ideology, as seen in German idealism. For example, we have the category. We start with consciousness, ideas. What is the correct idea? What is the perfect form of democracy? What is the true concept of freedom? And like he says, you descend then from heaven to earth. We can apply that then, if we have that consciousness, right, then we can apply that to life in this world, and we can say, well, do our actions violate or conform to that idea, that consciousness? Now Marx says this is what he's critiquing. And this is where I read, he says, consciousness does not determine life, life determines consciousness. And what he's saying is that, now just one other thing on this is similar to his earlier critique of religion as a form of ideology. What Marx is saying is that people construct this idea of religion, of God, of heaven, of some perfect, right, bliss, happiness, infinity of earth. Now, for Marx, this is quote unquote an inverted world consciousness, but it's not something mystical that you can't analyze. Oh, it's completely irrational, it's not comprehensible. No, Marx says we can analyze how we construct ideology. It arises out of conditions in this world. In the case of religion, he says you can analyze human alienation and how religion is a projection of, in fact, human alienation, that we don't fulfill ourselves in this world, that we do horrible things, and out of that we project some otherworldly picture, some ideology, and we put all of what's positive into that other world, and then we evaluate ourselves negatively in contrast to that. So what Marx is saying, this is how he's looking at German ideology. It's not mystical. What is it that's going on in society, in German life, economically, politically, and so forth, that gives rise to that kind of imaginary inverted consciousness? So then what he says is, let's show our approach, our historical materialist, radically, qualitatively different approach. And he starts out, and he has some very famous passages where he talks about, okay, our premise, and then he develops this. So what he says is, our premise, right, is this. We start with actual flesh and blood, real human beings, human individuals. That's what we're talking. Not some abstractions, some abstract. We're dealing with real human beings who live in this world in real ways. And now, he says, how do we analyze? As our first premise, our starting point. He said, you can examine human beings in multiple ways. He says, there are numerous ways. Anthropologists, sociologists, linguists, so there are many ways we can what distinguishes us as human. Right? So you can do that. But he says human beings, the way they begin to distinguish themselves as human beings is how they produce and reproduce their basic means of life. And there's a distinctive human way of doing that. And what he's saying is that is the material, historical basis of any society. Ours, any society. Human beings have to come together in cooperative relations in order to produce and reproduce their basic means of life. Otherwise you have no ethics, you have no art, you have no religion, you have no politics, you have no state. So, okay. Well, we have to examine that. That's the kind of thing that philosophers have felt was non-philosophical, pre-philosophical, or unworthy of philosophical investigation. Marx wants to reverse that. Okay? So what Marx is saying is when we examine how human beings produce and reproduce their basic means of life, this is not simply the level of mere survival. Because for him, that doesn't allow us to develop as human beings. It reduces us to an animalistic level of simply living under necessity. So Marx says, when we examine human beings, what are the forces of production in any society? What are the relations of production? What is the division of labor? What are the class relations and so forth? What we are looking at is we're looking at definite forms of how human beings are related as productive beings in definite arrangements under definite conditions. He says you have to look at all that. Conditions not of our own making. He says things like you have to look at geographical, climatic. For example, if you're an Eskimo, you have certain needs for clothing and so forth that are different from human beings living. If you're a human being who doesn't have access to water or food, let's say many Indian peasants I've known in India, women who will walk for a full day just to find water. They carry back on their head a whole day to come back. And now much of that water is privatized. You have people with guns who say, we're working for Coca-Cola. We'll say, well, you have to consider all these things and how human beings produce and reproduce their own life, their physical organization, their, all kinds of genetic factors, all kinds of things. And within that, human beings will create different relations of production that express, coming out of that historical, material, socioeconomic conditions, these are ways that they are expressing themselves. These are definite ways that they express themselves in terms of human expression, human activity. So this is how he sets it up. Then, and he says this is different from other animals. We're not the only animals that are productive. There's other animals who work hard, produce things. He talks about bees, he talks about spiders, he talks about all kinds of animals. But what he's saying is human beings have distinctive human ways that we're productive. Okay? And this is what he's trying to focus on. How we express ourselves. We share a lot with other animals. But there are distinctive ways that human beings express themselves through their productive activity. So then what he does, let's develop this, is he then talks about 4 different needs in terms of 4 basic premises. They think are true of any society, historically, materially, doesn't matter, not just capitalist societies or different capitalist societies at different stages. Any society has, so whether you go back to Paleolithic, hunter, food-gathering societies, any society, here is the foundation, the need structure. Every society must accommodate these 4 needs. So he gives you 4 premises. The first premise is, he says, all human beings have certain basic needs. You could call this need structure 1. Basic needs. And that need, for example, any human being has a certain need for a certain caloric intake, a certain amount of food, or even a dog. You may have a certain need for clothing, for shelter, for, you can go through what your need structure is, and people can debate it. For example, now a lot of people would say at a first level, basic need structure, human beings need to be able to communicate, to use language, to express themselves. Yeah, different, it takes, well, that's a good point, because you'll see how it takes many different forms. So that's one level, that you would just recognize there's certain basic, we would call it natural needs, that any human beings have. But that is never the full needs schedule. There's a second. He says, out of that, there develop other needs. And every human society has other needs, which you can't simply reduce to certain basic needs. In fact, most of the needs are what you could call second-level needs, or secondary needs. It doesn't mean they're less important. People may be willing to die for these secondary needs. But you could see where there's a difference in there. For example, well, that's a good example you gave. I mean, suppose you say something like, is the automobile a basic need or a secondary need? Well, it depends on the mode of production, the society, right? Even among our students, it would vary tremendously. But for many Americans, and this was part of historical material changes and so on, having an automobile is an essential need. You can't function just to get to work, to have a job, or to, like at that level. And for others, it's something you could do without, or it'd be a luxury. One sort. So it varies, and it's the same with, I had one student who said to me last year, she could not imagine that I did not carry an iPad. I didn't carry a cell phone. She found this unimaginable, that I would not carry a cell phone with me during the day. And she gave an example. She said if she did not have her cell phone, it would be like having a limb amputated. Because this was like an extension of her body. That's how she lived. Whereas to me, How could you live without? I said, because I don't want you to call me. You know, I have a life, you know, and I want to have more control over my needs. So it varies tremendously, and you can, you know, you can debate, but most of the needs we have are what Marx would call second-level needs. But those are human needs. You don't have human beings without those. Then you have, because of time, I'll just go quickly, you have what he calls procreation. Human beings have to reproduce. That has to be part of the mode of production and reproduction. And that can become very complex because it's not only biological conception and birth. So when Marx talks, this is where feminists and others have done a lot of work on, how do you produce and reproduce the worker, labor power, whatever the society is. It's a long process of socialization, prenatal, certainly after birth. Part of what you're doing at this university is how you are being reshaped in ways so you can sell your labor power on the market and so forth. So we have both, in no matter what form it takes, every human society has a need to reproduce. And then the fourth one, which is all different than the other three, Marx says, all of these first three needs, although they may seem to be natural, in some way natural, they're all also social. They're all also social. And by social, he means human beings, two or three or more, coming together in some kind of cooperative relation, doesn't mean it's voluntary, cooperative relation, in order to produce. So that is an essential part of any mode of production. So usually what we would say, well, it's human nature, or it's natural, or something. Marx is also trying to show how almost all of that, even when it seems to have some natural basis, the expressions it takes historically, socially, materially, are socially shaped, socially defined. Okay? So, I won't develop that. There's a lot that's interesting there. But let me just say, Marx then says, okay, at this point, only after we deal with the premises, the four premises, do we begin to talk now about consciousness. Consciousness, as opposed to how the idealists, the ideologists do it. In other words, consciousness emerges. It doesn't define. Consciousness does not have some independent essence or existence that then defines life in that way. Consciousness arises out of real, definite human relations, human production. Right? It arises out of that. And then, of course, Marx has a dialectical view. It also shapes. Marx says circumstances determine human beings, but human beings also determine circumstances. So Marx is not undermining or belittling consciousness. You don't have human beings without human consciousness. You don't have a human mode of production without human consciousness. But what he's saying is it's not independent, real ideas and consciousness. It's always conscious existence. Consciousness, it's always consciousness that arrives out of real, actual human life activity. So then, I'll just mention very quickly three other things. Marx then talks about, in many sections, what he calls the division of labor. And I'll just give you a little of that, because there's so much. Marx is saying, in terms of division of labor, which is part of how human beings relate, he says there is certain division of labor that takes place in every human being. There's a division of labor in each of our lives that we relate. For example, I'm up here, and I'm saying, I have an idea. How should I present Marx's ideology? I'm able to conceptualize that. Now, maybe I put that into practice. And I think I'll begin by reading some quotes from Marx. Sorry, just before this. It'll be an interesting, different way of beginning. Maybe I have an idea and I say, you know, I don't think I'll put that into practice. Human beings have this incredible flexibility of consciousness, unlike Marx thinks other animals that are more instinctive. We have a tremendous amount of flexibility. So I can imagine things, I can idealize, I can decide not to put it into practice. I can have an idea, and I can have you put it into practice. Division of labor, we find in the economy, in the productive part, in society. So what Marx says, he says a little about the sexual division of labor, but then mainly he says the first historical manifestation that we have of division of labor is actually the division between mental, he calls it mental and material labor. And what he says, it's very interesting because he says in developing this, at a certain level of historical development in the productive process, especially when we can create some surplus, and then there's the question, who owns the land, who owns the cattle, who owns the slaves, that becomes a real question. He says the division of labor develops in a way that it actually is manifested in terms of property relations. Who owns and controls the property, what's being produced, and it results in alienation, inequality, injustice. So this is a radical critique of the Enlightenment tradition, because what Marx is saying is, it's not only a critique of Hegel, but of people like John Locke and others, who actually share Locke and Marx in many ways, but for many, and Adam Smith in economics, who felt that the division of labor generally is something good. Not only does it allow you to produce all these goods, all this wealth, which Marx agrees with, far more than any previous system in human history, productive system in producing goods, commodities, but also for people like Locke and others in their social contract and so on. The division of labor is a way, it's a basis of equality, of freedom. I can have my own property. I can express myself through my own property. Now what Marx does, and it's a kind of confidence in this, and Marx looks at it and Marx says, you know, I look at society, what I find is the rule is not unalienated labor, it's alienated labor. That's what 90-something% of labor is. I don't see equality, I see inequality. I don't see freedom, I think unfreedom. I don't see liberation, I see domination. So that's why for Marx, unlike many modern thinkers, the division of labor is basically something negative. Not in some utopian scheme, but as it actually emerges historically, materially, socially. So for Marx, his view of communism here is part of it is the need to overcome the division of labor. Okay? Now, the two things that I'll just mention is very interesting. When Marx develops the division of labor, one of the big distinctions he makes is where he presents something on the state. And this is a total critique of Hegel's view. What Marx says, okay, what emerges historically is this division, on the one hand, between my own private self-interest versus, on the other hand, this sense of the public, right, the state, universal standards, right, the community. So what Marx says is this is actually an illusory distinction. This notion of the state as being neutral, we're all equal before the law, and the state will bring us these universal values of freedom, of equality, and so forth. For Marx, this is a wrong way of reading history. That in fact, and I gave you one or two quotes on that, that what the state represents is the state of the ruling class. The ruling class. And the basic structures and laws and ideas and so on are shaped by our basic historical, material, socioeconomic, division of labor, what's going on in the historical material world, how we're productive that way. So this is, it doesn't have an ideological existence of its own that we then apply. So what we would read, Marx says, we would read politics, for example, very differently. What you would see, and he's not a narrow reductionist, I'm just giving you a simple version, but it's his key version. In other words, if you think this is a battle between democracy versus aristocracy, monarchy, you know, different things, and that's how you read what's going on, you misread it. You have to deconstruct that. So what was happening in the last campaign wasn't here are these independent, who has the best ideas? So if you want to really get at what is going on in the debates, you would see, for example, that you do have contradictions between different class interests within the capitalist class. There are real contradictions. And that circumscribes, that limits, where you're operating within the same premises, the same framework, and then you're debating which means is more effective to achieve those ends, but you're not getting at the basic premises. That's not part of the discourse. It's not an option in terms of the legal system, the political system, the media, and so forth. In fact, so this is how Marx is looking at it, okay? And if you want, I call this a revolutionary work, if you want to talk about revolution, he's not against reforms in different cases. But if you want to talk about revolution, then you have to look at some qualitatively different framework. And then he talks about under what conditions is that possible. And this is the last point he has on communism. He has very little on communism. He never writes much on communism. And for good reasons. At one point he says, as opposed to ideology, communism, he says, is not some state of affairs to which life must conform. Like you have this blueprint, you have this idea, here's what communism is, and then you can impose it, say, okay, that's the right communism. He said, that's, you know, that would be an ideological, metaphysical way. You have the category, you're just going to impose it, and life has to conform to that. And Marx is against that. So what Marx says is to have a revolution, that's his aim, some future communist revolution. Marx says you have to have certain historical material conditions have to be right. He said otherwise you can have great ideas about communism, it's not going to make any difference. This is for thousands of years. We've had people with communist ideas, religious, other things, you know, and didn't make, in terms of what Marx is talking about, any difference. So he says in order to have revolution, on the one hand, you have to have the material conditions have to be right. In other words, those contradictions so emerge that it's possible to bring about communist revolution, historically material, in terms of situating it historically. If those conditions are not right, and Marx thought communism was only possible in affluence, when he was an Enlightenment thinker that way, when the means of production are so developed that people see, why do we have poverty in a society of affluence? Why don't people have health care when we could provide good health care for everyone? Why do students have to incur incredible student debt when we could provide free education for every student who develops, that's okay. Why? So he says on the one hand, you have to have the material conditions that allow for the revolutionary transformation, but you also need to have class consciousness. The fact that people are suffering doesn't bring about revolution. The only way you would bring about revolution, he says, if there was class consciousness the proletariat, the working class, and so forth, was mobilized and conscious, and the present conditions, the present way of life was intolerable. It just was intolerable. Only then could you have that kind of qualitative breakthrough. And what he does is, finally, he gives you, the last thing I'll mention, is he gives you this famous passage, which I was going to quote, but you all probably have heard of it. You know, he talks about in terms of the division of labor. He says, okay, right now what we have in our class society is we have a division of labor where you do this and you do that. Someone is a welder, someone is a weaver, someone works punching a computer, someone does this. In other words, our whole life is divided up in terms of division of labor. And this is a sign of alienation, of alienated labor. It doesn't allow for the free development of each as a condition for the free development of all. And what he says is, so he has this image, it's a very idyllic image, it's a famous one, where he says in a communist society, you could be a fisher, uses male, let's say a fisher person in the morning, you could be a hunter in the afternoon, you could be a literary critic in the evening, you could be a poet, you could do all kinds of things without your being defined as one or the other. Where it's different people have all this potential, all this human capacity, which would be set free to develop yourself in this all-around way. And so he develops that kind of an image of what it might look like to live in an unalienated society in which we overcome the kind of division of labor based on, as an expression of alienated labor. But it's a very kind of, very different from the rest of his analysis, say, of capitalism, pre-capitalism, because this is an image that isn't historical at all. And what's interesting, if anything, it's rural. Pre-capitalist. Marx has such contempt for the idiocy of rural life, quote unquote, and then he gives this kind of very romantic image, which, that's why I don't think it's presented as a scientific, economic sort of analysis. It's more mythic, allegorical, symbolic, kind of giving you a direction, just like as to what life could be like in a society that was organized in such a productive way that we were given the possibility of realizing all this different human potential that all of us have. Okay. So let me stop. I threw out a lot of stuff at you. And why don't I stop at this point? And to me, it's very, the whole thing is very relevant to today and very significant. Because I find when you look at this radically different way of analyzing things, I can apply it every single day. I watch television, read the newspaper, see how 90% of our courses are taught at the University of Maine. See how, it's very relevant. It provides a radical critique of the dominant class and so forth structure in which we find ourselves. So why don't we open it up for comments, questions, anything that's on your mind? Yep.
Yeah, you talk about many things. At different points when you were talking, I had different reactions, and I can't remember a lot of them now because you covered so much. But I mean, if we're going to talk about Marx, it seems like we want to say so much of what you said about him to us in our modern at this point in time sounds obviously right. And the ruling class controls the means of production have a sweeping effect on people's lives and how the classes and all that.
Right.
The question is, why hasn't it come about as Marx said it? Like you just said, we could provide health care for everybody.
Right.
the students wouldn't have to take on incredible debt. So the question is why he's right about so much, but yet why hasn't it come about? And
so what's the answer?
I think,
In terms of what I said today, just in Germanology, ideology, what's the answer? Okay, you have this idea, the system seems irrational in that way. If people have basic needs that are human needs that aren't being fulfilled, and we have the means, right? We're not living under necessity as some societies are, but we have the means to meet those needs. Why aren't we doing it?
and see, in our current situation, I think it's fair to call the middle class in this country the proletariat. I think it's fair. And so you could ask yourself, and in some ways the system is becoming what he said. I mean, the Occupy movement, 99% and the 1%, all the wealth is being concentrated in a few hands.
Right.
The middle class is struggling to have the kind of life that they think they deserve. And that's all what Marx said, that it would reach a point it would boil over and the proletariat would take over.
I'm saying he doesn't say that.
Oh, I thought...
So what I'm saying, let me just do a little, because you're going off in several directions that are good, but just back, because I'm trying to relate it to German ideology. So what Marx would say is, the fact that you have this idea, right, which is consistent with what he said, that by itself makes no difference. In other words, if the 1%, use the Occupy movement, I mean, Marx would look at the Occupy movement a year ago, and it would be a little bit, even more, than the way he looked right after he wrote this, when he wrote the Communist Manifesto, like, are we actually going to have all this working class revolution all over Europe? Okay? Marx would say, if you look, he would have supported Occupy, based on this, but Marx would have said, let's not get romantic about this. Occupy. Yes, the conditions are right. Occupy has no class consciousness. It's not mobilized. I mean, look at the people who are at Occupy. Let me give you an example, like in Bangor. If you want to make Occupy just people who are camping out, which I think is a mistake. But if you just say the people who defined Occupy, look at it. The ones that we have, well, first we turn a handful of people who are defining themselves as the 99%. There's no proletarian organizing, mass mobilization, and so forth. Some of them are right-wing libertarians, Ron Paul backers. They just hate big corporations and the big state. But they have radically different, their whole premises, everything is radically different. Then you have other people who are out there who were just homeless people. People often who had psychological problems. This was a place they could sleep at night. People who had not been involved for years and years and years have struggled, mobilizing, learning, you know, all that stuff that's necessary for revolution as Marx is using. Okay? So Marx would say the easy answer to your question is what Occupy did, which was very valuable, is very valuable. It put on the agenda the fact that we have this incredible concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the few in a very relevant way. It said to people, millions of people, why did you lose your homes? Why did you get those bad loans? Why did, we have all this wealth? Where did all these billionaires come from? All these Wall Street people who don't give a damn about any of the things you just discussed. Right? And here's a transfer through tax breaks and all this stuff from the rest to the super rich. Now Marx would say, it's not a romantic, sentimental thing. That's exactly the way you would expect free capitalists to behave. they're playing the capitalist game.
Proletariat isn't acting the way he said it was going to act.
Well, and it's like an addiction. So the good part is it's bringing this to consciousness. That this was not inevitable, right? But that by itself doesn't bring about proletarian consciousness, mobilizing resistance, class struggle. Marx would say the capitalist class still, capital dominates. If you just look at the historical material conditions, for example, the fact that students are so alienated and they are so suffering, you look at it like students live. I'm talking about bright, sensitive students. They're working so many hours a week. The average student at Jane Main lives with $29,000 of student debt. And this is not forgiven by law. This is all changed. You can't just default on this. And now students are working. It's like they're buying a home in the years. And now you have to pay back at interest. It's increasingly all privatized. And you can't. How are you going to get out? Is this the next 20 years of your life? So the fact that students feel increasingly oppressed by stuff doesn't mean that they have any consciousness that things could be otherwise. They may have no consciousness of how to resist, how to struggle, how to commit massive civil disobedience, where you just refuse to pay. I mean, this is not something that just pops into people's heads, and certainly individually they can't do that. It's very hard. So Marx would just say the simple answer from German ideology is if you want to understand why your very good question, why this transformation is not taking place, you have to understand the basic productive process. And it's a dynamic process, and how capital has been able to transform itself, to expand in all these different ways, to weaken the proletariat in all kinds of different ways. That is part of trying to understand why, that change has not come about.
Well, I was just going to say that, I mean, like the German ideology, what we have is the ruling class is controlling the media, the ruling class is controlling education, basically defining how people interpret their own relation to the relation of productions, and that's hidden. And it's gotten so complicated. I think it was somewhat easier to see when you had people working in the factory producing things that they made, and then someone else was appropriating their labor. Now it's a little bit more removed than that, so it's more difficult for people to see their relation to those. And so, but that's our task, I think, is in the progressive movement, is to help bring forward, and that's what the Occupy movement started to do, is to bring forward ways of understanding our relation to that 1%. And how do we, and I think different people, like he said, are based on where we are in the society, are experiencing that differently. But probably people at the bottom are experiencing it most severely, but they may not have the consciousness that those who have more are able to have, because I think those who are more affluent can see opportunities and have a different vision because of the affluence that we have. Whereas those who have less, they have less of the opportunity to do that. So that those who are more affluent can do more in terms of raising that consciousness and connecting with those issues. So.
That's right. And most poor people who are suffering, when you think about it, they have what I started out with, a certain ruling class ideology, and they'll blame themselves. I'm just a bad person. If I was a better person, I'd be successful. Or they have a religious conception. Okay, if I rebel, if I don't rebel, I'll go to heaven. I'll be reborn to a better rebirth, whatever. Or they just go off into substance abuse, alcoholism, domestic violence. I mean, there are all these different ways that they're manifesting their alienated labor that may not be, they may be counter-revolutionary. Like that. Okay, Martin?
I wanted to respond to what you said about middle class. You consider them to be proletariat. I don't think, I would disagree with that. And I don't think that just because you're working
say that, what I mean is that in terms of who owns the wealth.
Right, I mean, all that could be true, but it's, like Doug said, it also requires a class consciousness, and if people are still operating with the same idea that of the Enlightenment values and the capitalist values, that we want the pie, this is actually straight from what Doug and I talked about, people just want the pie divided up more equally, which is a good deal, a good thing, if they think that they deserve more because they work so hard. That's not a proletariat, that doesn't make the, I mean, that's not a class consciousness. That means just dividing the pie. It's still operating with the same framework of capitalism, but just making everything more equitable. It doesn't ever remove.
Well, I don't think he said that I mean, he talked about the proletariat, but yet during his lifetime, I don't think the working people they didn't have a consciousness that they were the proletariat.
Oh, many of them did.
Well, some of them did, sure. But
Actually, see, what's interesting about Marx's writing, and as many people say that it's much more true today than it was then, I mean, a very small percentage of workers were proletarians during Marx's lifetime. Most workers were not wage laboring. I mean, they were workers, right? Most of these societies, even Marx's Germany, they hadn't gone through industrial revolution. They hadn't, I mean, there was still the struggle. There were still rural peasants, serfs who had very different relations. So the thing, though, is it's not a simple thing as how you define proletariat or working class. For example, in terms of the German ideology that I cited to you, a lot of great work has been done by Marxist feminists. So if you ask a question in terms of some of this promotive reproduction, it's right. Okay, suppose you have a woman who, it's becoming less and less, but the woman who stays at home, raises the children, has a role as a mother, right? Wife, mother, family, and all this, doesn't receive a wage. So if you define proletariat as simply the person who on the market sells one's labor power for a wage, that means that these women are not working class. Right? Well, a lot of feminists said that's really inadequate. The capitalist system cannot function without unpaid labor. Unpaid labor is productive. I mean, to say, if I'm working as a domestic in your home for some agency and I get a salary, then I'm a working class. But if I'm doing the same work in my home, without which my husband could not go and work, and that's not, you're not proletariat, is inadequate. So I think this notion of what is working class within capitalism actually has gone through a lot of reformulations. Right? Often citing passages in Marx, but ways that Marx didn't develop at all. And then this whole notion about revolution. Some people say, well, Marx has defined this too narrowly as a proletarian revolution. This is where you get all these attempts to say, okay, we have to bring together now class, gender, race, you know, there are all kinds of variables here. There are many different ways that people are oppressed and exploited, that are structures of injustice, and that how can those people cooperate? I mean, to say, like some workers classically said, well, you know, they had a kind of condescending view towards it. You're not really a proletariat. Like we even know in the 60s, 70s, we had a lot of friends who were in different left, Marxist, factionalist groups. They had the most condescending view about students. Students aren't workers. And they had a very narrow view, you know, of what a worker is, which basically put students outside in some way. They weren't an essential part of that capitalist system. Most of us see now that it's very narrow. Right?
I was going to say another thing that complicates the understanding of proletariat since the time Marx is writing. There are a lot of people who are against the way very high levels of skill that can come in, very high salaries, capitalist enterprises. And you don't have a particular strong material interest to revolutionize.
That's right. That's right.
And they're what we call them part of the middle class, or, I mean, they are wage workers in some way, but they're a part of the middle class that is not particularly revolutionary.
That's right. So you had, this is where you had, again, all this Marxist research that came out. But it's very interesting over the decades. Should we call these people, quote, the new bourgeoisie? Different from the old, they don't own and control the means of production. Should we call them the new working class? Who have a kind of very different class relationship to the classical proletariat? And I thought also you might mention, because it's so true, how do you classify things like our being professors?
Huge level of state
employment, or the people who are being trained at the University of Maine not to be classical proletarians, but to have some intermediate status where they're going to supervise or control clerical workers, people, all these people in Wall Street, people who are making a killing and they're not producing anything of any value. How does that fit into? So, it shows that there's no simple model. That historical materialist analysis is that you have to contextualize things. You have to be open to analyzing things in new ways. You had your hand up.
I was just going to say I had a discussion with someone at work, working in a college major. So I asked someone why they were voting for Romney, and they said, because I believe some businesses and some people work harder than others,
Yeah.
and there's a conception of that the environment that we're brought up in may not be conducive to bringing about certain possibilities that are latent in society. And I just expressed how I like to view it as sometimes a disguised feudal system. You can probably pick that apart. But
Yeah, but that's a very good point you made. Now, it's a perfect example of what I presented from German theology. Where did this person you spoke to, where did they get this idea from? Where did they get this idea? Empirical evidence, all sociological, other empirical evidence, shows that poor people work really hard. They work really hard. In fact, they often work so hard to try to survive. I mean, this image that they're poor because they're lazy, or they don't work hard, and that people who get ahead work harder. Work hard. And this, where did you get a notion of this? Well, it's a ruling class notion. People got it. They didn't get it from their own experience, right? And or that the idea of what I occupy, that these traders, right, derivatives, hedge funds, all this stuff, these people who are making hundreds of millions of dollars, they have 5 cars, they have 4 homes to live in, no matter what they have, it's not enough. That they work harder than someone who works in the mill, than someone who's out there in the winter paving roads and doing that kind. I mean, where does that come from?
People's rationalizations.
Yeah, you had your.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of on the backside of what you said, the idea that there's this 1% and there's this 99% is very true to a certain extent. Although we tend to forget that we 99% are extraordinarily historically wealthy. We've never had this amount of money available, either through credit cards or through capital in the form of our houses and things like that. That the impetus for revolution for the 99% is not there, and it's not there in the sense. And I'm reacting more to your comment that the middle class is proletariat, and I think that the middle class is closer to petit bourgeoisie that's hoping to get sucked up into the 1%. And we have this little gift that Marx says in the manifesto, you have to give this, you have to have the proletariat idea that they can rise up. And it's this almost bribery that we
Yeah.
all imagine we're going to have our 4 houses eventually if we just work hard.
That's right, that's right.
And it's a fog that prevents any